Hey y'all, and welcome back to Ghosts and Glitter. My name's Rachel and this is part 1 of my top 10 books that I read last year in 2022. Just a heads up, while I'm filming, my husband is playing D&D, so if you hear random yelling in the background, that's why. I'm doing this in 2 parts because I realized half of the books that I read last year that made my top 10 were horror books. So I figured I would do part 1 and talk about all the horror books that made my top 10, and part 2 will be all the not horror books. And at the end of every video, I will also throw in some honorable mentions that were wonderful, but just quite didn't make top 10. Before I get into it, don't forget to like and subscribe. All the books I mentioned will be in the description box down below, as well as any creators that I mentioned. So without further ado, let's get into it. My number 1 book that I read last year that topped out everything else is, of course, My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. So if you don't know, My Heart is a Chainsaw takes place in Proof Rock, Idaho, and we follow our protagonist, Jade. She lives in this rural town that is quickly being gentrified. Before she knows it, people start disappearing, bodies start turning up, and Jade becomes convinced that she is living in her own real-life slasher. Now, Jade is an encyclopedia of slasher movies, and that becomes evident by the little essays that she writes that are between each chapter. Also, each chapter title is like the same title as a classic like 80s slasher film as well, which was just really fun to like see some of the more obscure slashers come up. And it definitely increased my movie watch list by a lot. Honestly, it's been a while since a character popped off the page this much for me. Like by the end of the book, I was like so in love with Jade as a character. I felt like I could give you a tour of Proof Rock if I wanted to. Like everything was so vivid reading this book. I know for some people this book was kind of a slow burn, but for me, I couldn't stop turning the pages, and when the kills did happen, they did not disappoint. They were every bit as gory and gratuitous as a horror lover could hope for. This book has quickly become a comfort read for me. I will flip to some of my favorite chapters and just dive back into the world of Proof Rock when I'm in a reading slump or just need some comfort in my day. I know it's kind of weird to have a horror book as your comfort read, but such is the life of someone who loves horror. I adored this book. It not only was my favorite book of last year, but is one of my favorite books of all time. The next book to make the list is Mary, An Awakening of Terror by Nat Cassidy. This book, when I first heard about it, it was sort of on my radar, but the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I'll wait for other people to read this. It doesn't exactly seem like my cup of tea. It's kind of a longer book, and I had heard it compared to like Carrie, but following a woman going through menopause as the catalyst of the horror instead of a girl getting her first period. And I was like, that's interesting, but like, do we need a whole redo of Carrie? Like, I was just kind of skeptical. But then reviews started coming in. I heard Katrina's review when she read it over at Katrina Brown, and she loved it, and I was like, maybe I need to give this a go. And I'm so glad I did, because obviously it was one of my favorite books that I read last year. It is about a woman going through menopause and the horrors that come with that, but it's also so much more than that. To talk about all the elements that are in this book would spoil it though, so I'm not going to do a deep dive. I will tell you that we follow our main character, Mary, who is like this quiet, unassuming, middle-aged woman. It's from her point of view the entire time, and I found her to be such a sympathetic character. Everything she felt, be it sadness, anger, joy, anything, I was feeling it right along with her. Some of the elements of horror in here is that Mary hears voices in her head, and also when she looks in the mirror, she sees horrifying visions. I'll leave it at that for the horror element. But what really kickstarts this story is Mary moving back to her hometown in Arizona to help her ailing aunt, who she has kind of a torrid past with. I think this book has such an excellent sense of place. It takes place in this small town in the dry desert of Arizona, and I don't think it could take place anywhere else. The setting for this added to the atmosphere, the isolation. It really needed to take place where it did. I highly recommend picking this up and going into it not knowing very much at all. I think even reading the entire blurb on the back, the synopsis on the back, would spoil some things that to me were a complete surprise when they happened. There are images that I can't get out of my head. There's also a song in the book. It's a real song that as I was reading it, that song was stuck in my head for days. It's an excellent book and I highly recommend it, particularly the audiobook. I did a blended read of this. I ended up reading most of it as an audiobook though, and it is such a well-produced audiobook. The narrator for Mary is fantastic, and it made the story that much more immersive. Number 3 on the list is What Moves the Dead by T. Kingfisher. I love T. Kingfisher. She can do no wrong for me at this point. Like, everything she comes out with, I just devour. So What Moves the Dead is a Gothic novella that is a retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's classic short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. I adored this book. It is atmospheric, it is creepy without being scary. It might be scary for some people, I'm sure it is, but for me it wasn't scary, just more like a constant sense of dread. So in this book, we are following our main character, Alex, who is going to the House of Usher because they have received word that their childhood friend, Madeline Usher, is dying. So Alex goes to the House of Usher just to comfort Madeline's brother and to be with Madeline in her last days. What we have here is a moldy, rural manor. We have like possessed wildlife, like wildlife that is moving unnaturally, behaving unnaturally. We have disturbing sleepwalking encounters and plenty of fungi, if you can't tell by the cover. I think this cover is great marketing for the book because I got exactly what I wanted. I got beauty, I got fungi, I got creepy nature elements. It was fantastic. I do want to reiterate that this is a Gothic novel. If you're not a fan of Gothic vibes, if you can't be satisfied simply by atmosphere or a slow burn, then maybe this isn't for you. But if you are curious about getting into Gothic books, I think this would be a great one to go with. It is short and I think it's a great representation of modern Gothic tales. The next book on this list is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. I read this, I think near the end of October. It was one of my picks for the Halloween weekend readathon, but I never got a chance to talk about it on the channel. So A Head Full of Ghosts is a possession horror, but it's also a lot more than that. This follows the lives of the Barrett family, a typical suburban family of 4. Their oldest daughter, Marjorie, is exhibiting signs of acute schizophrenia, and doctors have done nothing to help her. So her parents start thinking maybe it's not schizophrenia, maybe she's actually possessed, and they arrange an exorcism to take place. This whole story is told from the perspective of Marjorie's younger sister, Mary. This book, like I said, it's a possession novel, but it's also a lot more than that. And it really explores like how we treat and perceive mental illness. I haven't read a lot by Paul Tremblay, but what I have read, this is my favorite of his by far. This book touches on how mental health is handled and perceived in society. So it offers a lot for discussion, but it also hands down delivers on the horror elements. I listened to the audiobook for this. I highly recommend reading this book in audio form. And finally, the 5th horror book that made my top 10 list is more of a literary horror. It is light on the horror elements for sure, but it still tends to be put in that category. And that is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This book was flowery and poetic in the best way. I absolutely love this story, but I do want to set expectations that the strangeness and the weirdness that happens is never explained. I know a lot of readers could be really frustrated by that. If you are one of those readers that needs even a tiny element of explanation, do not read this book. Because even for me, who loves things that are not explained, I was surprised at the lack of explanation. Now that you've been warned, let me tell you what this book is actually about. We have 2 main characters, Leia and her wife, Miri. Leia is a marine biologist who has gone on a routine expedition in a submarine, and something happens and the submarine does not surface for, I think, months after it's supposed to. When Leia finally does return to land and to her wife Miri, she is a changed person. Miri is just trying to take care of Leia and her new eccentricities, her new quirks, while also trying to find out what actually happened in the time that Leia was missing. This is a multiple perspective book, switching between Miri's perspective and Leia's perspective. And Leia does give insight from her perspective on what happened in the submarine. This book was romantic, it was poetic, it was grotesque when the horror elements were introduced. It tugged on my heartstrings, it made me cry. It's just a beautiful, it's a beautiful book. If you like literary fiction and are wanting to dip your toe into horror, I think this would be a great way to go, because I don't think the horror elements were too horrifying. But like I said, when they were there, they did hit like a gut punch. In the way it was told, it's almost like a drawn out fairy tale. And I'm quickly learning that anything that has fairy tale elements is probably going to be a win for me. So if you like literary fiction, literary horror, this is a really short book. And like I said, if you're okay with zero explanation, and I cannot emphasize the zero enough, then I highly recommend this book. So I have a couple of honorable mentions here. Actually, I think there might be 3. These were books that I had a great time with, but like I said, just didn't quite make the top 10. So the first book is Confessions by Kanae Minato. This is another book where I can't say too much of what it's about, because it really does have a bunch of layers that unveil themselves as the book progresses. But I will give you the main setup, which is we're following a teacher at the beginning of the book whose young daughter has recently died. And this teacher is at her last day of work teaching her middle school students. And she basically says, my daughter was murdered and one of you did it. One of you in this room did it. And that's the setup. And it just spirals from there. This is another multiple perspective book. I think there's 5 different perspectives in this book, and each perspective tells the story from part 1 just from that person's unique perspective, and it just adds more layers to the story. And by the time this book ended, I was so drawn in and so invested. This book is fascinating, easy to devour in one go if you're listening to it on audiobook and you're on a long trip, which I think is a great way to consume it. It's a quick read. It's, like I said, it's a really fascinating look at these different people's lives and how their lives intersected around this tragic event. And yeah, it was really good. The next book on this list is The Least of My Scars by Stephen Graham Jones. This is one of his shorter books and one of what I think his most disgusting. I'm just gonna read this blurb for you real quick because I think it sums it up better than I could. So, William Colton Hughes is living his fantasy. His victims are delivered to his apartment every few days. But when he's suddenly alone, no visitors, nobody to talk to but himself, he begins to lose what little of his mind he has left. So, if you can't tell by that blurb, we are following the perspective of a serial killer who stays in his apartment and has his victims delivered to him. This book kind of blew my mind a little bit. It's twisty-turvy. It is a little sprinkling of insanity, claustrophobia, absolute disgusting, gloopy, grimy, disgusting things happen in this book, but in the best way possible. It was confusing, also in the best way possible, like purposefully confusing, and a nail biter. By the end of this book, I just ended up staring in a corner and thinking about it. Like when it ended, I was just like, oh, I kind of want to read it again. Definitely a fever dream of a book. And finally, the last honorable mention I have here is The Rotting Within by Matt Kurtz. So this follows our main character, Kinsey, and her 2 children. She is kind of on the run from her very abusive boyfriend. And she finds sanctuary in this Airbnb Airbnb, no, just a regular B&B. It was just a regular bed and breakfast run by her estranged grandmother that she hasn't talked to ever? I think ever. While they are staying at this bed and breakfast, Kinsey and her 2 kids agree to Shirley, her grandmother's, one rule, and that is to stay away from the 3rd floor, which is housing these 2 creepy elderly women. That's the main premise of the book. Obviously, when your main character in a horror book is told not to go somewhere, the catalyst is kind of them going there. So obviously the 3rd floor has things happening. These 2 reclusive old ladies are very creepy and very strange. This book was fun and scary and kind of twisted. Based on the cover, I was expecting more body horror than this book actually had in it, but that did not deplete my enjoyment of this at all. What we do get is creepy old ladies, an unexplained sickness, and this twisted cat and mouse game of chase that happens in this bed and breakfast. I thought this was really well done. Like I said, it was genuinely pretty scary. Highly recommend reading it in the dark at night. But yeah, it was a good time, and I definitely want to check out more from this author when he comes out with more. So those were the top 5 horror books that I read last year, the first half of my top 10 books of 2022, plus some honorable mentions. I hope that you check out some of these books. If you've read any of them, let me know your thoughts on them down below, and I will see you in part 2.